Schuyler Bailar,
The first transgender male.
The first openly transgender athlete.
the first ever transgender person to play on an NCAA men's team.
Testosterone is one of the only arguments about why trans women shouldn't compete in women's sports. Could you maybe present the key arguments why you disagree with them?
There is available research that supports that testosterone suppression does produce meaningful competition between cis and trans women. Michael Phelps produces half the levels of lactic acid. He's got twice the lung capacity of the average person. But when people talk about that, what do they say? Wow. If those differences exist in the women's category, it is immediately considered unfair.
If I were to decide tomorrow that I was a 47-year-old woman, should I be allowed to go shower in a women's locker room?
There's been no actual effect on sexual assault statistics across the states when this was kind of implemented.
It is playing on real fears that I think are valid. We do need to protect women and girls.
How optimistic are you, Schuyler, and what do you think the next steps are now?
I think Leah's one of the clearest examples of the loudest voices aren't necessarily the right ones or even the factual ones. Like, for example, in the book, how you mentioned saying something like she was 426th competing against men and then first. And one of the things that loud voices do as like an act of violence against trans people is purposeful misgendering. And that leads me to, I just wanted to ask you a question, which I think you may not have even spoken about in specifics before, is in Korean, there's no gendered pronouns. Is that right?
Yeah, correct.
And I've thought about that as part of gender liberation. Like if we just got rid of gender pronouns, that might reduce the importance. And I was wondering, do you notice like an effect in the difference on culture at all from having that removal?
That's a really good question. And I think there's a couple different ways we could answer it. The first is that while I'll just use your example of Korean, while Korean does not have gendered pronouns, many other words are gendered. And this is similar with, I think, many other languages that don't have gendered pronouns. They have other gendered epithets. And so, for example, the family relationships are really important in a lot of East Asian cultures. And you can see that reflected in the words, but their family relationships dependent on gender. So if I right now, for example, the word that I would use to refer to my brother would be different based on age, as well as like age in line, who's older, as well as gender. So right now, like he would call me Hyung, which is a younger boy to an older brother. So that's Hyung, but I call him Tongseng, which is an older brother to a younger brother. And with sister, he is beforehand, right before I transitioned, he would call me Nuna, which is younger boy to older sister. But if he had been a girl, he would have called me Unni. So there's lots of other ways that culture gets wrapped into language. I think, for example, in Korean, I think that sort of the reflection of relationship being gendered and aged is reflective of cultural values, right? And so gender is still there, just not in pronouns. The reason I'm saying this is because I think that many cultures have solidified importances of different relationships between people, be it gender or age or status, what have you, that is reflected in language. And sometimes that has included not gendering, right? There's like a famous fact within the community of how, like I believe it's Yoruba, there was no word for woman before colonization, and a lot of structure in that society was not structured around gender, but rather about hierarchical age, and so age was the most important distinguishing factor, and so there wasn't even a word for woman because that wasn't a distinguishing sort of detail, right? So. Would the world, English speaking world be better if we removed, gendered pronouns from English and everybody was they, them, for example? Perhaps, but we would have to have that reflected in our cultural values, right? We would have to have gender not be the most important thing that we think about when we think about others. But right now, most people, the first thing they do when they meet somebody or see somebody even walking down the street is they gender them. They might not even notice that they're doing that. But the first thing is, oh, who'd you see down the street? Oh, a man who blank, a woman who blank. And if we can't figure out their gender, that's the first thing we notice, right? So we have been socialized to believe and to experience the world with gender as one of the most, if not the most important characteristics about somebody. And until we can remove that, I don't think it will matter how much we degender, pronouns, for example, because it's something we've attached so much value to in society. I don't know if that makes sense or answers your question.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I think like one of the misconceptions with it is kind of that is what causes it to stick is kind of the naturalization that kind of this is how it is. There's just men and there's just women, and that's kind of the natural way it's been. And then kind of queerness has kind of been a recent thing what has jumped out. But like you say, for example, in Yoruba, there wasn't the word for women. In indigenous cultures, there's also, I can't remember the exact term. So is it two-spirit?
Some people use the word two-spirit. That was a term that actually came out of a desire to create sort of like pan-Indian, pan-Native American, what's the right word? Sort of like collective community. And I believe it was the 1960s or 1970s. I wrote it in the book, of course. Don't remember the actual date. But so two-spirit is not a word that exists in any specific native language, but because they were trying to create sort of a general community, they used the word two-spirit to be accepting or inclusive of many different indigenous terms that a lot of them have been lost due to, again, effects of colonization. And then some of them that, we can name a few here and there. So, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So, but yeah, like I say, kind of one of the misconceptions is that queerness and gender and different conceptions of gender have kind of jumped out of nowhere. What are some of like the other biggest misconceptions like that you come across that are kind of the easiest ones to just deal with straight away and just...
I mean, that's a great one. I'm glad you named it because so many people think that, trans people are infecting the world with transness and everybody's becoming trans. But the reality is that we've always been here. We just haven't always been talked about in this same way. And a lot of the strict ways we see gender now are a result of different systems of oppression saying this is how we have to be. And these are the small boxes we need to fit in. Other misconceptions. A lot of people think being trans is a choice. And I don't know anybody who's chosen to be trans. I know that we choose to come out. We choose to share identities. We might choose to transition, undergo gender affirmation processes, but nobody is choosing their gender identity the same way that people who are not trans don't choose theirs. You don't choose not to be trans. You don't choose to be trans. So that's a big one. I think with the sports conversation that we've touched on and perhaps are going to come back to, I think a big misconception is that trans people, particularly trans women, are either a threat to sports or a threat to women's sports, or are really just people who are trying to win sports by transition. And the reality is that trans people don't transition to play sports. People transition to live, right? To be themselves, and also happen sometimes to be athletes. In terms of the threatening women's sports, there's so much we could go by there. And if you want, we can really break that down. But I think that the shortest answer is there's absolutely no evidence that supports this argument that trans women have ever dominated or currently dominate women's sports. We've had inclusive policies in the NCAA where I competed, as well as in the Olympics and beyond, that have included trans women for a long time now. And we haven't seen this, massive rise of trans women competing in women's sports. In fact, most people cannot name a single trans woman who have ever won a national or international competition, even though they think of Leah Thomas. Most people can't name her. And I'm like, if trans women have been dominating women's sports, don't you think you'd be able to name a few? And most people can't. Or if they can name Leah, great, they can name one, right? So I think, again, there's much more we could talk about there, but that's a short answer on that front.
Hey guys, I hope you're enjoying the episode. I just wanted to drop you in a word from our sponsor, Manscaped. You can use the discount code LOAF to get your discount, because even a lion needs to tame its mane.
Get the Performance Package 5.0 Ultra from Manscaped now. Stay fresh with no cuts, so that your baguette leaves no crumbs.
Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed that short clip with Schuyler Bailar. If you want to check out the full episode, click right here. Since you got to the end, I'm assuming you liked the video, so please leave a like. It really helps the channel. And subscribe, because we got loads more like that coming very soon.